The Intercollegiate
Psychedelics Network.
Now, actually, before we get right into the questions, can I have each of you just go around and introduce yourselves real quick? With just a quick reintroduction from earlier, so our audience can remember who y'all are, and we'll get to that question. So, how about James? How about you start us off, and then we can have you popcorn. You can pick the next person to introduce themselves.
Good evening, everybody, or good afternoon, depending upon where you're from. My name is James Hosobe. I'm a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm studying, pharmaceutical sciences. And one of the big things that I'm interested in is intersecting psychedelic sciences, neuroscience, and what music does. I'm very curious as far as taking a psychoactive substance and truly investigating how it alters our auditory perception, depending upon whether it's MDMA, ketamine, or LSD. I feel as if these molecules can definitely alter how we perceive various audio stimuli, particularly with music. And so I think that's a really big passion of mine, is investigating everything that has to do with psychedelic assisted therapies and the music that's associated with these sessions. Without further ado, I'll pass the mic on over to Michael. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Michael. I'm a rising junior at Harvard College, studying statistics, and my project dealt with the topic of undergraduate psychedelic education. I'll popcorn to Stephanie.
Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie. I'm located in Berlin, so good night from here. And yes, I studied sociology, but I have been mostly working as a user experience researcher, and my passion has always been psychedelics. So I'm hoping to be able to deep dive more into doing research in this area, and I'm really interested about how we heal individual trauma. We can also have an impact on collective trauma as well. And I will pass it over to Mitsu.
Thanks, Stephanie. Hi, everyone. I'm Mitsu. I completed my master's in clinical psychology from Columbia University. My talk was on decolonization of knowledge systems, psychedelics, and the imagination. Within the psychedelic space, I do a bunch of different things. So I am the co-founder of the Asian Psychedelic Collective. Check us out if you're not familiar with us. I also do research at the New School at the Psychedelic Humanities Lab. And I'm just so excited to be here. And I'll pass it on to Rain.
Hi, everyone. So yeah, I'm Rain. I'm a dual degree candidate studying social work and fine art at the University of Pennsylvania. And I am also on the graduate advisory board of the Penn Psychedelics Collaborative. And we just had a big conference last weekend. Peter was there, was one of our great volunteers. But yeah, in terms of next steps for me, just really trying to get that off the ground and get a research center here at Penn, and then hopefully a training program. So yeah, that's what I've been working on. I think that's everyone.
That is everyone. So we do have a number of questions that have come throughout the day for each and every one of you. I guess there's a number of places to start. I think, let's see where we can begin here. I have a whole list of them. So I'd love to start sort of with Michael. Speaking to you, you definitely touched a little bit on my own personal interest as a musician. not just to make this about myself. I think we all kind of do that. We find the things that we're interested in, be it social work and photography, and bring that to light. So I just want to definitely hone in on a question for you here. It sounds like you would advocate for a more broad versus niche, deep approach to undergraduate classes about psychedelics, but the breadth of what we could teach about psychedelics is massive. So how do we decide which fields of study to prioritize when teaching about psychedelics? This question asker is especially curious about whether and how we teach students about religious spiritual perspectives, implications of psychedelics, or the historical uses of it, because it's a big field.
Yeah, like I think I mentioned this more towards the end of my presentation. It's like there will come a point where we have to decide like whose stories do we tell, what science do we teach, and so for sure that's like, and I think that's one of the harder things about developing like courses, or for just like any field in general, and so I think it's less on focusing on the specific material itself and more so teaching like a mindset or a toolkit that students can then take on to explore any niche field they want to.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. When thinking about sort of how undergraduate courses are structured, they start broad and then they narrow down into your neuroscience, into your social work, into your therapeutics. So, it's a great way to answer that. Thank you very much for that, Michael. I guess I definitely sort of want to jump to Stephanie, a question for you that I think definitely is one that we need to ask in order to contextualize how we would go about doing something like that, how we would go about creating sort of undergraduate research or broadening the amount of general knowledge we have. What kind of research do we have related to psychedelic experiences, dissolving the hegemonical patriarchal mindsets that we already exist in our culture and that participants exist in, and sort of help them realize its perils? So is there any research in that regard?
I think something that could be very interesting is also diving a little bit more into women and psychedelics, which is a topic that I haven't personally deep dived into yet, but I'm quite curious, especially in the spiritual field. There is a lot about doing women's circles or healing with other women, and I would be really curious to learn more how women and psychedelics have been going on through history, how indigenous communities also understood this topic and these dynamics of power. So I think definitely that is a very relevant topic, and I'm not aware of much research on it.
Alrighty, awesome, thank you. So our next question is for James. And the question is, what do you think is the ideal way to decide on a music playlist for a given person's psychedelic-assisted therapy session? In other words, if you could lay out the protocol for that, how would you do it?
Thank you for that question. And that's the million-dollar question, right? So I feel like it's really important to look to the historical figures that were really pioneers per se with music and psychedelics. We can look back at Walter Pahnke and Helen Bonney. They did a fair amount of good research over at the Maryland Psychiatric Hospital. And I feel like to tackle the first question about choosing the right playlist, this might be controversial, but I feel as if having a standardized playlist is not appropriate. I feel as if each playlist should be individually customized per client based off of their prior likes. We got to be very careful and mindful about certain music either triggering somebody, or certain music that is supposed to be calming could actually be anxiety inducing for some. So having either, I call it the MEQ squared, the musical experience questionnaire instead of mystical. But I feel like it's important for psychotherapists alike to talk to their clients about what kind of music genres do you like? that can bring you some kind of relaxation or kind of introspection, whether it's ambient music or classical. And then upon that, there's this huge, big discussion about putting in musical pieces that evoke nostalgia. It's tricky because you don't want the music to be the driver's seat of the session. You want the music to be a comfort blanket. And so it's a very difficult balancing act, I would say. And to be quite honest, I really don't believe there is a perfect playlist. I feel like we can create and curate playlists that could attempt to maximize therapeutic outcomes. But if you have a client that says, I'm dying to listen to Beethoven's Ninth at my peak, you got to ask your client, okay, is it something that you want control over? Do you want control over this situation, or what's the real deal here? Are you trying to really process your traumas and try to introspectively look at your past, or are you trying to manipulate the situation? So it's a very difficult and challenging balancing act for the psychotherapist. So I hope that answered your question. But to kind of reiterate the key point, there should be not one similar playlist. It should be all individualized and customized per person. Very good question.
Awesome. Yes, I have a follow-up question, and maybe Peter does too here. But I've thought personally, like from my own research, about the music that people choose as one method of helping people connect more with a culture that they either come from, that they feel really connected to and stuff. I guess you're kind of nodding in approval, but yeah, do you have any extra thoughts on maybe choosing specific cultural music that resonates with the person?
Oh, most definitely. And what a wonderful topic. Yeah, so looking at some of the text from Marina Sabina, she had stated that she would play a lot of historically, I guess, Latin-based music with her clients, which evoked more of a cultural appreciation for their who they represented. Now, I'm under the theory that if you propose a musical playlist that is foreign to an individual, so let's say if you have a Westerner, a Caucasian Westerner, listening to Indian music with a sitar, I'm under the suspicion that because of that foreignness, you might evoke mystical type experiences, because this foreignness equates to mysteriousness, which may evoke guru type vibes, to say it lightly. So I feel as if the more foreign the music is, the more, I guess, definitely it would alter the experience versus somebody with a European classical background per se. In regards to cultural music, I think that could definitely help with those who suffer from culturally based traumas to be more empowered by who they are as an individual. So me, I'm a Japanese American. So if I were to go into a session and listen to traditional shamisen with the Japanese flute, who's to say that I could have more evoked, I guess, positive connections with my heritage. So I would be for that, so long as it's therapeutic for the individual, to introduce more classical-based music. I briefly spoke with Chris Timberman from Imperial College at the conference in Colorado, and I asked him that same very question about cultural music and about playlist curation. And he made a very good point. He had stated it's not necessarily about choosing the individual songs, but it's more about the journey in which you take the person. And so I think you can have some flexibility and bounce around different genres so long as it's smooth and smooth transitions, and you have a purpose as to why you selected a particular tune for the specific, I guess, duration, whether it's your ascension, your peak, or your afterglow phase.
Cool. That answers
Thank
it.
you. Yeah.
Thank you.
I love that answer. I think it sort of brings up the question of, can we sort of curate these playlists for sort of specific modes of thought or emotional states, a light and upbeat or happy playlist, or for example, one, if you're looking at something like nostalgia and you're looking at processing a traumatic experience, moving through that from a musical standpoint, through a playlist that helps foster that. So could we create playlists specific for things clients are trying to work through? Or do you think it's so difficult to be able to do that that the individual differences in people are too great to predict any outcomes based on those playlists?
That's a wonderful question, Peter. And my theory right now, it probably is a difficult task, but I would give it 50 years from now. Google just launched, I believe, this one text to artificial intelligent curated music. And so I feel as if we can maybe lean more towards AI-based technologies to help choose and curate the playlist based off of your prior likes. So in a perfect world, I'd love to look and screen at your Spotify, your Apple Play, your YouTube history, and then type in curate 6-hour playlist for this specific compound at this specific dosing to match the peak ascension, the ascension in the afterglow phase based off of beats per minute, tempo, and even the instrumentation that we use. That's very important, the tonality in which the instrument selection, because you're going to have a very different experience if you're listening to African bongos versus Bach. And that's another interesting point too. If you have a psychotherapist that is a musician themselves, do we allow them autonomy to play music for their client, like a live session? It's discussion that I'm really interested in having in the psychedelic DJ per se.
I'm like envisioning the implications of that for group therapy too. Like if there's a group of people going through something and having like a live band play for that. So I think it'd be a little bit overkill to have like a live band for like an individual session. That might be a little bit intense, but if it's for like a group of, 20 people or something, I think that'd be cool personally to have some live music going on. Or to have the person themselves in the session being like, if they're an artist or something, like using that as a place for them to go with their session or something. And yeah, there's just a lot of places that that can go with the music.
Yeah, I attended a workshop, the MDMA music workshop at the MAPS conference, and one of the curators was describing if he had a patient who was a musician himself and he was trying to process some traumas. And so what they said was, if you want to bring an instrument like a guitar, do it. And he actually played during his session, and that was very therapeutic. So I'm all for it. So long as, number one, we really focus on the client and making sure that they're not triggered and they're in a good place. But two, I really want to hone in on this. The music should not take over the experience. And I think that's why a lot of discussion about non-lyrical based music, asterisk, so long as it's foreign or not in your mother tongue. If you're listening to music that's in another language, I think that could veer the entire session in an entirely different direction, and I have some questions about that. But particularly, I think ambient, lo-fi hip hop, I think that's the standard as of right now.
As our playlist reflects.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, but great questions. Thank you.
I do kind of want to transition to Rain, if that's all right with you. Rain, yeah, music is one of those huge buttons that we think about when we think of set and setting. Rain, I just want to ask, so how do you see the positive impacts after a psychedelic assisted therapy session last into one's daily life within the context of using photography as a means to sort of help integrate that? And are there ways or means that you've seen that prolong or expand these effects?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in my research, I haven't seen anything that specifically relates to that, like studies that have been done. I've read a lot about people using therapeutic photography or the other technique I talked about, which is phototherapy, which is a little bit more guided, like by a mental health professional. So I've seen things like that for traumatic experiences, chronic illness, all sorts of things. And I've worked myself with different groups, but I've never seen specifically for psychedelic assisted therapy integration. So that's why I am sort of just starting to understand what that could look like. But I think yeah, I think it's definitely like a new terrain. But what I was talking about in my presentation, and what I really think is that the ways that taking a photograph can increase, it's proven to like increase mindfulness and increase connection with your memories and your feelings. I think that could couple really well with some of the things that maybe come out during the psychedelic assisted therapy sessions. So, so obviously I don't know, I'd have to do more research on it. I don't think that like using a camera in the session would necessarily be a good fit. I just don't see that really working, but that's why I really emphasize the integration aspect, because I think that, talking with someone afterwards with a therapist and having some activities that you could do each day could kind of like bring you back to like some sort of connection with yourself and with your memories, and kind of tune back into that, that space that you were accessing in the session, if that makes sense. But yeah, no, it's super exciting. I think it's just, I would love to like read more about it, but unfortunately it doesn't really exist right now.
Well, you're the one in the process of creating it.
So that idea of doing it afterwards kind of stuck out to me, because it definitely makes sense to me. But then I also wonder if having them also take photos beforehand could also have beneficial effects in like, because I'm thinking of like when I learn something, I like to see the progress that I make, like to be able to compare like, oh, I'm over here now, and I remember when I started I was over here. So do you think there's any benefit to that, of like having people take photos beforehand without necessarily giving much instruction or anything, or like giving minimal instruction, and then like having them see the way that they progress and either like their ability to take the photo or just like their level of presence when they take the photo, anything like that?
Yeah, I also think that photo taking beforehand could be really impactful. For the purposes of today, I just focused on integration, but I think having it in preparation sessions as well would be powerful. And I was just it's a different thing, but I was just talking to someone who was telling me about how they took up photo taking when they were battling cancer, and how like taking the photos every week as they were experiencing their treatment really helped them to process things like in the moment and just sort of like externalize it. And then a few years later, looking back at the photos, like they were really happy that they had documented that progress. So I feel like that's just one example, but I think that if a similar thing were applied to going through like a series of treatments with psychedelics, I think that it could be helpful for people to see like, this is where I am now, this is where I started, this is how I got there. So yeah, I definitely think so.
I know we didn't mention this at the first, but all the other panelists, you can all ask each other questions too and follow up and whatnot. We can have this be like sort of more conversational. So if you have follow-ups, feel free to do that. Because I'm thinking of another one too, of like, there's, hearing things like people using equine therapy, horses as like a form of therapy, or working with dogs, or even like dance therapy. And I'm noticing an overlap with the photo taking of like, is it just helpful for people to get a hobby? Is that therapeutic in itself, or like, I don't know, like, or do you see like extra benefits? Like you were kind of pointing out of like, the benefit that photography has is that it's something that you can reflect on and go back to, because it's something physical that you have. So that seems like something unique about it. But yeah, I'm curious if there's any thoughts about that. Like, is it just that they're getting a hobby, or is there benefits above and beyond that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think so. I've worked with like older adults in the past, and I feel like for them, that was super beneficial to learn. A lot of them were like, I want this to be therapeutic, but I also want to learn how to use my camera so I can take pictures of my grandchildren. So there was sort of this like dual purpose. And for a lot of people, I think just as, we live in this like image world and we're super oversaturated with images, like you kind of need that competency to like know how to navigate things and to understand like how the world works for the most part. Like images are just everywhere. So I think it's important to like know how to take photos and to get a hobby. That could be really great, but I do feel like there's a deeper psychological aspect to photos, which I touched a little bit on in the talk, but just that they elicit responses in us when we're looking at them. And if we want to or not, it's everyone has different associations with pictures when they see them. And especially if it's like your personal photos or photos that you've taken, it's even stronger, just in being able, and I know music has that effect as well, but being able to look at a photo and process the relationships that you maybe had with the people in the photo, or transitions you've gone through, or different things. There's there's various ways that you could interpret it, but yeah, so I don't know. I don't know if that answered the question, but I do think that it can serve like a few purposes, and definitely one would be just getting competency in like knowing how to take a photo.
Cool, yeah. Alrighty, so the next question is for Mitsu. The question is, how do you think a researcher would or should approach the very important problem that you brought up, which is the possibilities of a psychedelic trip either reinforcing the dominant ideology or creating new worldviews?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I feel like my presentation was really centered around that question of how researchers, therapists can really begin to understand where a person who's going through an experience, where are they really coming from? What is their, what are their beliefs? What are their perspectives? What is the cosmology that they are really embedded in? And I think in order to do that, or one step in that direction of understanding where the person is coming from, is to perhaps have a more robust relationship building period, if it is within a therapeutic setting, if it's within like the Oregon model, for example. And it seems so far that just the way that the therapeutic model is set up, that there really isn't sufficient time for a therapist to get to know their client on a deeper level. So that's a bit tricky. And, if I were to think about that same question within a community setting, for example, I think it would start to answer that question a bit more, because if those journeys, if those experiences are happening within a community setting, I would imagine that there would be perhaps more of an understanding of who the person is and what the nature of the community is. Perhaps they all have similar belief systems, the way that they look at the world, the way they've begun to really break down the way that they perceive things would be maybe similar. But then now that I say that, one question that comes to mind for me is, it would be important in a communal setting to be aware of what's being reinforced again. Like what are the common beliefs that the community is kind of reinforcing in that setting, and how is that then showing up in the journeys they take together individually, and also in the integration period. How is that really being addressed, essentially?
Yeah, that's something I've spent some time thinking about too. I think, as I was mentioning earlier with James's thing in music and cultural music, I've thought about the potential benefit of helping or bringing in people who are a close part of the client's life and trying to integrate them in certain key points along the therapeutic process, and how that could be both helpful and tricky, because if it's, especially if it's a family member or something, there's that quote, something about like, if you think you've become enlightened or something, spend a week with your family, because they're like the most triggering people in our lives. They were with us in our developmental years and everything. And it's like, or that's one thing that they can do, is like trigger us in certain ways. But so yeah, just to say, like, there's ways it could go wrong, but I also see benefits of it, because I see, like, especially if it's embedded in some sort of cultural familiarity for the person, that they're like around people and places that are familiar to them, that they feel comfortable, and that they are connected to sort of the perspectives that go along with that culture, and how that could help root and ground things. So I think the question in here is like, how do you see, like, what do you think is the best way to navigate that? Because I think, like, there's the one thing where you could have people do the ceremony together in a group, in a community, or you could have people do a ceremony individually and perhaps do some integration as like part of the community and part as an individual or something. I guess like how do you have any opinions about like the best ways to navigate that?
That's a great question. And I would say at the moment, I really don't. I think either situation could really, it really depends on the client, the person themselves, and what kind of experience perhaps they want to have. And, you know, James was mentioning this earlier of if someone is trying to address cultural trauma or culture, like just identity, if they want to be doing identity work, then it could be beneficial to be doing that in a community setting where there are a lot of elements that the person has in common with the person that they're journeying with. But I keep coming back to this question of if it is within that communal setting, you know, I'm Indian. I'm gonna take myself as an example and put myself in that situation of if I were to be in a ceremonial space with other Indian folks, there is so much cultural trauma, so much intergenerational trauma that yes, within that space might get blown apart, and we might have the opportunity to really begin to talk about it openly and begin to, you know, walk towards some sort of healing and some sort of resolution on that front. But I can also see it going in another direction of it perhaps reinforcing certain things that we are carrying within our lineage. So really could go either way. And I think that's part of what I love about this space. It's just so open-ended and there's so many incredible perspectives people have. I mean, this room here is a great example of that. So thanks for the question.
Yeah. So it looks like we also got a question that is relating to things we were just talking about. And I don't know, it was asked just a minute ago, so I don't know if it came in while we were just chatting with Mitsu or if it came in while we were chatting with Rain. So if, I mean, any attendees who have a thought on this, feel free to chime in. But it's very relevant to what we were just saying. The question is, how about listening to a talk from philosophers, neuroscientists, or spiritual leaders who are culturally relating while on the trip? First thing come to my mind is like Alan Watts or something like that, or Terence McKenna. But yeah, what do you guys think about that? And feel free, anybody who has a thought on this, to answer.
So when I look at this question, it sounds to me like it's about, you got to ask the person about the intent of the experience. Is the individual looking to obtain insight from Alan Watts or Ram Dass and have it overlaid with some bass drum? I don't know. I really don't know a good answer for that. Especially in the field, in the realm of psychedelic assisted therapy. Personally, I feel as if having a philosophical leader guide you through your trip may prime you in a specific direction. Whether it's therapeutic or not can be up for debate. But I feel as if it's the intent in which the individual wants to endure. Now, I feel like if you have these clinical trials in a university setting, I don't think that would fly because there's too much priming. You hear an individual, you hear the words, and instead of really introspectively looking at the traumas that you're trying to process, you hear Ram Dass saying, "Who are you?" And you're all, "Whoa, who am I?" And it completely, I think, redirects the train tracks into another direction. And if you didn't have those lyrics, you could be thinking about things that the overall experience was intended for. So who knows, if you have a client that really is gung-ho about Alan Watts' voice and feels as if they would have a mystical type experience listening to him during a trip, and if the psychotherapist has the green light, I mean, sure, but it has to be done very delicately, in my opinion.
I guess I do just have a different way to sort of think of that. What of listening to a talk from yourself, sort of turning that in on, okay, here's what I want out of this. Let me ask these questions of myself prior to, sort of in a state of priming and sobriety, and then moving into that state of acute psychedelia and sort of, okay, here's my intention of it. Here's sort of a repeated phrase or questions I have for myself. What are your thoughts on that? Sort of open to anyone.
Really briefly, Peter, I'll mention there's a company, a booth at the conference, and essentially they use your own voice and record it, and then you have it played out with ambient type music. And I think that that's a field that's being investigated currently. Who knows? I think that could be definitely beneficial, hearing your own voice. And if you have scripted recordings of words of encouragement or something that you really want to overcome in a trippy state of mind, using it, because generally speaking, I think most people hate the sound of their own voice when they hear a recording. It's cringy. We're like, ugh. But I feel as if, though, if you listen to your own voice while undergoing a psychedelic experience, I think it may turn out to be positive in some regards. It just depends on the individual. But I would be very curious to hear other people's opinions and thoughts on that matter.
Personally, what I wanted to add is I totally agree that the intention that you have is super important when defining which setup you want to have, but also what type of substance you are choosing, I think plays a big role. But ultimately, what I find really important is that you trust the other person that you are getting into the experience with. It doesn't matter if it's a spiritual coach or a psychotherapist, that you can have some good previous rapport with this person, and that you feel is the right person for that intention that you have. I think that is extremely relevant. And I don't know about hearing my own voice. Now I think it's creepy, but I would love to experiment with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a real depth of relevance to just the connection you're having with the other person on the other side of that to begin with. But I mean, maybe it doesn't necessarily have to be sort of a recording of your own voice. It could just be having a list of affirmations and saying it yourself does enough to begin with. I love this sort of line of questioning. We still have a number to cover yet that I really want to get through just for those who have asked in the chat. So just going back to you, Stephanie, can we consider a scenario where a large corporation begins holding sort of psychedelic retreats? Someone's asked this in the chat. For their own employees with the intention of team building and aligning with the mission of the organization. Do you think some of the pros and cons of that use of psychedelics could be in Western culture? There's a lot.
I'm not sure I get the question because it's quite long, but I will try to answer.
All right.
I do think we have I think it's amazing that we are having so much progress in the pharmaceutical field and more the medical field. But then what happens with licenses and what happens about the access of psychedelic substances for people that do not want to use them in that specific setup. So I think it's still important that we can also protect that people can access those substances in other environments, and we don't end up with some monopolization of substances by pharma companies, because then they have a lot of power and things. They can actually get into politics and even sabotage the criminalizations of substances in certain countries. So I do think it's important to be mindful about that, and to also give relevance and do research on the use of psychedelic substances outside of the medical environments as well. And regarding big corporations, like I can say I have personal experience working for big tech corporations, and what I do see happening a lot, also with the startups that might get into the landscape as well, is that a lot of times they are trying to prove profit fast, and they end up forgetting or not paying attention to the side effects. Like, I think every action we do has positive and it will have side effects. Sometimes we are not even aware in advance of the side effects. We realize on the go. But yeah, I think it's important to know what are your boundaries, what are the things that you are not going to commit on for the sake of trying to prove your business and get more funding. And this, yeah, takes us to the topic of ethics, which I think it's really important. But I don't have much answers. I think it's up to all of us as a psychedelic community to start thinking what are the ethics of the work that we do. So I think I answered. I hope I did. It was a good but very complex question.
Yeah, I think that answers it. Yeah, that's a big question. And it calls into question, I don't know, lots of different things about how the different ways that psychedelics could be used. Because what I was getting from the question was, so it's kind of the scenario where, so like Google, we could say, Google takes, a handful of their employees down to like Mexico or something for a psilocybin retreat, but Google is like kind of dictating the intention of the thing rather than it like being a communal sort of thing or something, maybe. And it's like, like a team building thing. There's like leadership retreats and stuff like that. So what if, I mean, that's a feasible scenario. But like, to me, it's like kind of speaking back to, I mean, if we want to go really dark with it, we can consider like the MK Ultra program where like the government was trying to like use LSD as like a mind control substance or something. And like, what if it's a way to, I don't know, get your employees to, I don't know, align with your mission, your business mission or something, but in a really kind of, I don't know, I'm inclined to think about it from like a dark place, but it could also be beautiful if it's like, if it's a beautiful mission and if it's a beautiful alignment and everything. I don't know. Yeah, it definitely gets into the ethics world. We should get ethicists to speak next year. Yeah, thanks for answering that. I don't know, did you have any follow-ups on that? Based on what I was just saying.
No, not really, but I think sometimes it just gives me the chills when I think about psychedelics to be more productive in this capitalist system. It's like all is all about productivity, and there's been a lot of talk about, having microdosing for being more productive. And this is really the place where we want to go, being even more productive? Don't we already work a lot? So yeah, just thinking as the people from Alma were saying, like, we can think about psychedelics as a tool, as our allies, but it can take us to so many different places. And yes, I'm sure like also many different people and communities are going to have different goals that they want to achieve. So yeah, I'm really curious about how the landscape is going to look like in 30 years.
Yeah, I think you and everybody, so many directions it could go. Alrighty, we have another question for Rain, and that is, what other significant research has Judy Weiser done? And I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And what is she best known for? Or could you speak a bit more on how photo taking may also help to process past emotions?
Yeah, sure. So for the first one, she's really best known for the Phototherapy Center in Vancouver, Canada. It's the place she founded and runs. And she's an educator. She does training programs. She's a psychologist by profession, and she has this Facebook page that I'm part of called like Phototherapy, Therapeutic Photography, and Video Therapy, and it has 10,000 people in it, and it's pretty great. It's just sort of a place for people interested in using photography therapeutically to come and ask questions and connect with each other. And it's an international page, so people from all over are on it. And then for the second part, what was it? How can emotions and
Yeah, it was, where did it go? Could you speak a bit more on how photo taking may also help to process past emotions?
Sure. Yeah. So I think that it can help in a lot of ways, but it's reminding me of this one person I was working with who shared a photo of her and her dad had recently passed away, and it was a photo of her from her childhood, where he was like holding her up. And she said that, I had this photo for so many years and it was always just a photo I kept around, but it didn't mean like too much to me. It was, cute, but I didn't really think deeply about it. And then after he passed away, like I realized the impact he had throughout my life and like how it took on more of a literal meaning, of like someone who's lifted me up. And so it had that like psychosocial impact. So I think, that's just one that came to mind, but I have a lot of examples of that, and even in my own photo taking and my own archives that I look at, but how our memories are unreliable, and and sometimes our emotions about things can change over time. And I think that photography can help to re-examine those relationships. And sometimes it might not be something you want to do because it can be painful or difficult, but it's just one tool.
Cool, that's fascinating.
Thank you for that answer, Rain. Have another question for Michael.
All right, I'll ask it. So I think this one is actually part of the end of the question you were asked last time. I don't know if it was fully addressed or not, but it's a question of whether or how students should be taught about religious or spiritual perspectives and or implications of psychedelics, and also how the historical uses of psychedelics have been used. Yeah, did that track? Do you need us to repeat the question, Michael?
No, yeah, I completely understood it. Thank you. And so I guess the thing is, I feel like as someone that hasn't studied like religion or history or has focused on education, I feel like I'm not in a position to like actually give what that type of advice or like, but the goal of my project wasn't to give like this like full-fledged like, okay, this is what we need to do. It was more so like of a starting point for discussion and thought related to psychedelic education, and the fact that like we might need to start structuring it very soon, depending on where the field goes in the next coming years. But I mean, I guess yeah, that's my answer. I unfortunately can't give that type of insight. But obviously, like with my plan, I do plan on including, or like I would hope that in structuring education methodologies, we include people that are very skilled in their respective fields, and they come together and figure out what would be the best way to teach this. And yeah.
Great, well answered. Yeah, sometimes it's a skill to be able to say when we don't know something, when it's not like our area of expertise. Beautiful. Okay, so all right, we have 9 minutes left still. We can move on to some questions that were asked to any or all presenters. So the first one there is, are there any unexpected risks associated with the topic of your presentation, and or what are some of the big unknowns in your topic? So I guess maybe the way we can go about this is that we can do like a popcorn style, pick someone and you can start, and you feel free to pass, like if you don't feel like you have anything substantial to say about that, feel free to just say, pass or something. But yeah, we'll start with, how about Mitsu? I'll repeat the question. Are there any unexpected risks associated with the topic of your presentation, and or what are some of the big unknowns?
Thank you for that question. So my mind immediately goes to the fact that So I'm an immigrant to this country, and so I have often thought about whether it's even safe for me to be openly talking about psychedelics, psychedelic research, anything related to psychedelics. So I am wary of that risk. That's more of a personal risk. Related to my research, I imagine that potentially the biggest risk related to my research questions is that it is very open-ended and it's very abstract. And because it is related to ethics, I think it can be taken in many different directions, and it can really be bolded in whatever way is most serves, like, for example, an organization's agenda. We were talking earlier about how corporations might do like psilocybin retreats in order to get everyone on board on their vision or whatever it is. So I think that there is a potential for the questions I ask to really be played around with in not so ethical ways. And that's part of the reason why I want to keep exploring these questions and keep asking them, keep talking to different people who are doing work within ethics and psychedelics and philosophy and psychedelics. So yeah, that's where I land. And I'll popcorn it to James.
Thank you. I think in regards to music and psychedelics, one of the biggest fears that I have is seeing psychotherapists use audio stimuli as a form of mind control. I know it kind of sounds a little far-fetched, but who's to say that a therapist curates a playlist in which they feel or deem as therapeutic, but in reality, it's definitely doing the opposite effect? And I feel as if certain playlists or any type of audio stimuli in that matter can be used in a way for nefarious purposes. And I'll give you an example. So let's say if somebody's doing an MDMA trial and they're listening and or couples counseling, and the psychotherapist deems it appropriate to turn on Marvin Gaye, Let's Get It On, right? And they're at their peak experience. Is that ethical? It's a very sensual song and it's a very, powerful, uplifting, but at the same token though, is that right? And or even if we were to listen to a tune that reminds us of an ex-partner, I think that could bring up a lot of negative emotionality. If you're trying to process that, sure. But I'm very weary about music that's selected or music that is created for the purpose of trying to control or put a particular individual in a direction that is not consented, if that makes sense. And a question that I have for everybody, and I had a brilliant conversation with Hamilton Morris about this matter, is the addition to silent tripping. That's a very interesting realm that I'm trying to investigate, especially with, there's many anecdotal blogs with users of ketamine who say that they do a dose of ketamine without any music, and they call it cold running. And it's a very icy or dark or very, I guess, non-warmth experience. So I think that we really need to have careful consideration about what type of audio stimulus we put into our ears during these very vulnerable states. And with that, I will pass it on to Michael.
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, I kind of forgot the question, but is it that the gist is like what are like our fears about our project, or like what's the unknown?
Yeah, unexpected risks or big unknowns.
Okay. Like I guess I would say one unexpected risk is that it might be years for even like a plan for integrating like psychedelic related education into universities and colleges. Well, just because like one, I think it's still in its the psychedelic renaissance is still in its primitive stages. But also too, to teach a psychedelic course, I feel like you need faculty that I've like worked in the space or familiar with the space. And I'm not sure how common those are at institutions right now. So there is that risk if we try to integrate in like the very traditional, like teaching a course in a college type of way, which might force us to like create more accessible forms of education, like through like virtual classes, or just like resources online instead of like the more traditional like classroom and teacher mode.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm supposed to popcorn it. Who has not been popcorned yet? Rain,
Stephanie and Rain, yeah.
Rain, I'll popcorn to you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I don't know if I have too many thoughts on this just because it's not something that's really being incorporated quite yet, but I think if it were to be, there's some ethical considerations. I mean, pretty much similar to any like therapeutic encounter relationship. Consent and, you know, explaining to people what the process of taking a photo is, or maybe preparing them for some of the emotions that could come up. I think it could tie well into the preparation for the psychedelic session itself though. But yeah, I think it would be cool if I do, you know, end up facilitating this sort of program, I would definitely spend time coming up with the guidelines and the parameters, because I do think that's super important. But I just, you know, at this point don't know too much about it.
Yeah, fair enough.
And Stephanie, sorry.
Yes, I think the first thing that comes to my mind when I think about decriminalization is that maybe we cannot expect also to arrive to some universal truths about how things should be everywhere in the planet, or having that risk that we arrive, okay, this is working in a specific country, and then we try to apply that to other countries. I've lived in 4 different countries, and when I reflect on that, and I think about how those countries work, like in terms of politics and economics and human rights, then I think this is something that it would best to have more regional approach. So maybe not trying to come up with one solution that works in one specific country or area of the world, and then we are trying to impose that towards other places. I think that is one risk that could happen, and I think there are many unknowns that we will discover among the years.
Great. Yeah, beautiful answers. Thank you all for taking that question. And it is 10 after the hour, which concludes our Q&A session.